The Navy called them the Queens of the Fleet. That was the official designation, not informal, not poetic license, but actual doctrine language used in Bureau of Ships publications and fleet communiques. Fleet carriers, the thinking went, were the most powerful warships ever constructed. They projected air power across hundreds of miles of ocean. They launched strikes that destroyed enemy fleets before a single surface gun could be brought to bear. The men who served aboard them were part of something historic, something decisive, something that the naval planners of 1942 believed represented the pinnacle of American sea power. There were recruiting posters. They showed flight decks swept clean and magnificent, aircraft lined up in perfect rows, the ship cutting through blue water with a kind of impossible confidence. What those posters did not show was the inside of Boiler Room 4 on USS Essex in August of 1944, where the air temperature registered 142 degrees Fahrenheit, and the men working inside it were pouring sweat at a rate that stripped their bodies of 4 to 6 pounds of fluid per watch. It did not show the berthing compartments 5 decks below the waterline, where 3,448 men slept in spaces designed for 2,600. Stacked 3 bunks high with 18 inches of vertical clearance per man. It did not show the flight deck crews who lost fingers to spinning propellers and arms to arresting wire failures. And it said nothing at all about what happened aboard USS Bunker Hill on the morning of May 11, 1945, when 2 kamikazes struck within 30 seconds of each other and 393 men died in a fire that burned for 6 hours without stopping. The Queens of the Fleet. That was the official position. Here is the documented one. Of the 24 fleet and light carriers the United States Navy commissioned during the Second World War, 12 were struck by enemy action severe enough to require return to stateside shipyards for major repair. 3 were sunk outright: Yorktown, Wasp, and Hornet, before the tide of the Pacific War shifted. Dozens of crew members were killed in operational accidents for every man who died in combat. And the men who served aboard these ships, in the engineering spaces and the flight decks and the magazines and the damage control parties, experienced something the Bureau of Ships publications never addressed with any honesty. A form of sustained physical endurance under conditions that would have been considered legally unacceptable in any American civilian industry. The recruiting posters showed you the ship. They did not show you what it cost to keep it alive. The air temperature in those spaces routinely exceeded 130 degrees during normal operations. During high-speed runs, particularly combat maneuvers when the ship was trying to turn into the wind for flight operations, while simultaneously evading attack, temperatures inside Boiler Room 1 and 2 on USS Yorktown. 2 reached 147 degrees, as recorded in the ship's engineering log from the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. You did not volunteer for the engineering spaces. You were assigned there. Start with the numbers that defined existence before you ever got near a battle. An Essex-class carrier displaced 27,100 tons fully loaded. She stretched 872 feet from stem to stern. Her flight deck covered 4.1 acres of armored steel. 4 Westinghouse-geared turbines drove her through the water at 32.7 knots, fed by 8 Babcock and Wilcox boilers operating at 565 degrees and 565 pounds per square inch of steam pressure. Those boilers consumed 1,900 gallons of fuel oil per hour at full speed. The engineering spaces required a complement of roughly 300 men working in rotating watches to keep them operational. Each watch in the forward fire rooms, the spaces immediately adjacent to the boilers, lasted 4 hours. Those 1,000 extra men slept somewhere. In practice, they slept in racks stacked so close to one another that the man in the second tier could feel the springs of the rack above him pressing against his forehead. Enlisted berthing compartments in the lower decks of an Essex-class carrier measured approximately 45 by 60 feet. Roughly the footprint of a modest suburban house, and contained between 150 and 200 racks arranged in columns of 3. The racks themselves were 72 inches long and 28 inches wide, canvas stretched across a pipe frame with 22 inches of vertical clearance to the rack above. You did not sit up. The crew complement aboard a typical Essex-class carrier by mid-1944 was somewhere between 3,200 and 3,600 men, depending on the ship's specific anti-aircraft battery configuration. The designed complement was 2,631. The gap, nearly 1,000 additional men, came almost entirely from the expansion of the ship's anti-aircraft armament following the kamikaze threat. An Essex leaving the yard in 1944 might carry 72 40mm Bofors guns in quad and twin mounts, plus between 40 and 60 20mm Oerlikon cannons. Each quad 40mm mount required a crew of 11 men to operate at combat effectiveness. The 20mm positions required 2 men each. The ammunition handlers, the fire control teams, the loader crews, add them all together, and you had added nearly 1,000 men to a ship that had not grown by a single inch of internal space. You rolled out. The compartment held your rack, a small locker measuring 12 by 18 inches for all personal possessions, and nothing else. No chair, no table, no space to stand upright between the columns without pressing your back against someone else's rack or someone else's body. The ventilation blowers moved air through these spaces at a volume that would have been adequate for 200 men. There were 350 men trying to sleep in shifts in that same volume of air. In the South Pacific in summer, the ambient temperature in enlisted berthing averaged 96 degrees. The smell has been described in dozens of post-war accounts, and it is worth attempting to render it accurately because it was one of the defining conditions of life aboard these ships. Hundreds of men sleeping in tropical heat with no regular access to shower facilities. Fresh water was rationed to approximately 3.5 gallons per man per day, with priority given to the boilers, the galleys, and drinking water before personal hygiene, produced an atmosphere that veteran sailors described as something between a gymnasium locker room and a rendering plant. You adapted to it within 72 hours. Your olfactory system simply stopped registering the baseline. When you went topside after a week at sea and then came back below, the smell hit you again, like something solid. Then it disappeared again. Every man aboard knew this cycle, and nobody discussed it. Showers were officially permitted 3 times per week. In practice, during extended operations when the evaporators were running below capacity, or when the freshwater allocation was being diverted to critical systems, showers were suspended entirely for periods of 5 to 10 days. When showers were available, the shipboard system produced a timed flow. You had approximately 3 minutes. Wet down, soap, rinse. The water shut off automatically. During periods of saltwater rationing, the ship provided saltwater soap, a compound that technically produced a lather, but left a residue on skin that never fully dried in 90% tropical humidity. Men wiped themselves down between shower days with rags dampened from the scuttlebutt. That was the reality of personal hygiene aboard the Queens of the Fleet. The food was its own chapter. Navy supply doctrine held that carrier crews should be fed at a standard comparable to a good American restaurant. The fleet logistics system allocated funds accordingly. For the first 8 to 12 days after leaving port, when refrigerated stores held fresh provisions, this claim had some basis in reality. Real eggs, fresh bread, meat that had not been processed into a canned loaf, milk from actual containers. On USS Intrepid, a seaman named Robert Hicks from Terre Haute, Indiana, later wrote that his first breakfast aboard was the best meal he had eaten since leaving home. Scrambled eggs, bacon, toast, and orange juice. He ate it in 1943. He would not see that combination again until 1945. After the fresh stores ran out, the menu rotated on a 21-day cycle that became as familiar to the crew as their own names. Powdered eggs reconstituted with water and cooked on industrial griddles produced a substance that was yellow and technically edible and bore no other relationship to eggs. Powdered milk mixed into a thin, faintly sweet liquid that settled strangely on the stomach. Canned vegetables, green beans, corn, peas, carrots, served in rotation, so that within a month you had eaten each of them a dozen times. Spam, which the Navy called canned meat product in its supply manifests, appeared so frequently that men developed a specific private hostility toward it that lasted the rest of their lives. The galleys operated in 110-degree heat on the lower decks, and the cooks working 14-hour days to feed 3,400 men across 6 meal sittings found that the tropical conditions affected everything. Bread mold appeared within 36 hours of baking, Refrigeration units failed regularly under the strain of the climate and the operational demands on the ship's electrical systems. Meat stored improperly developed a smell that the cooks disguised with whatever seasoning was available and served anyway because there was nothing else. Inspecting your food before eating became habit, not paranoia. Habit. You learned to look. Weevils appeared in the flour stores by the third week of most extended deployments, not occasionally, consistently. The standard practice among bakers was to sift flour twice before use, and then proceed regardless, because flour was not optional, and the alternative was no bread at all. Men ate bread with weevil fragments in it for months. They knew this. Most did not comment on it after the first few weeks. The physical layout of the ship created a geography of experience that differed radically depending on where you were assigned. Officers lived in staterooms in the island, and the gallery deck spaces still cramped by any reasonable standard, 2 or 3 men to a compartment, but with an actual door, a surface to write at, a light that could be switched on without disturbing 30 sleeping men. Flag officers and the captain had private cabins. These were not luxurious. The captain's sea cabin on an Essex-class carrier measured approximately 12 by 14 feet. But it was private, and privacy on a ship of 3,400 men was a form of wealth more valuable than any pay differential. The division between the experience of officers and enlisted men aboard a carrier was not principally about comfort, though comfort differed. It was about agency. An officer had a professional identity aboard the ship. He was the gunnery officer, the air officer, the executive officer. And with that identity came a degree of narrative control over his own situation. He understood the overall picture. He received briefings. He knew the operational schedule. An enlisted man knew his battle station, his watch schedule, and what was directly in front of him at any given moment. He did not know when the ship would return to port, what the next operational objective was, or why, on a particular Tuesday, he was suddenly called to battle stations for a threat that never materialized. He was inside the machine without access to its instrument panel. This produced a specific psychological condition that the Navy's 1944 operational fatigue study noted but did not adequately analyze, a form of institutionalized helplessness that wore on men over months of deployment more steadily than any individual danger. You could not change anything. You could not know anything beyond your immediate environment. You ate what appeared, worked when ordered, slept when possible, and waited for information that might never come. Men in this condition, and this is documented across multiple carrier crew interviews, conducted by historians in the 1970s and 1980s, described losing track of time in a fundamental way within the first 3 weeks of extended deployment. The days ceased to differentiate themselves. Routine consumed the calendar. Men who could tell you precisely what date it was on their first day at sea frequently could not tell you within a week what month it was after 60 days without port. The flight deck was something else entirely. The flight deck of an Essex-class carrier in the Pacific was simultaneously the most critical operational space on the ship and the most brutally hostile working environment that American sailors encountered in any theater. During flight operations, it was a coordinated ballet of organized violence conducted on a moving platform in any weather the Pacific chose to produce. Dozens of aircraft, Hellcats, Avengers, Dauntlesses, Corsairs were spotted, fueled, armed, launched, recovered, rearmed, refueled, and launched again, in cycles that ran sometimes for 18 consecutive hours without pause. The flight deck crew, the plane handlers in their yellow jerseys, the fueling crews in purple, the ordnance men in red, the catapult operators in green, the plane directors waving aircraft into position, worked in an environment where the consequence of a mistake was measured in immediate physical catastrophe. The deck itself was a hazard, steel non-skid plating heated by tropical sun to temperatures that burned through the soles of standard-issue shoes. The jet wash from aircraft engines running at full power created wind forces that could lift an unwary sailor off the deck. Propeller arcs were invisible at speed. A spinning 3-bladed propeller on an F-6F Hellcat turned at 2,700 revolutions per minute, and the blur was indistinguishable from empty air at more than 18 inches distance. Men died this way, not rarely. A 1944 Bureau of Medicine and Surgery study of carrier operational casualties found that 31% of flight deck fatalities during non-combat flight operations resulted from propeller strikes, followed by arresting wire incidents at 24% and falls overboard at 18%. These were the deaths that happened when nothing was going wrong, when the ship was not under attack, when the only enemy was the machinery itself. The arresting wires, 7 cables stretched across the aft section of the flight deck to catch the tailhook of returning aircraft, operated under extraordinary tension. Each wire was 1.25-inch steel cable, rated to absorb the kinetic energy of a 10,000-pound aircraft landing at 85 knots, bringing it to a stop in approximately 150 feet. When a wire parted under load, it did so with a force that could sever a limb at the point of contact. Wire failures were documented across multiple carriers throughout the war. On USS Lexington II in late 1943, a parted wire during recovery operations struck a plane director named Petty Officer Second Class James Calloway across both legs below the knee. He was 23 years old. He survived. He did not return to the flight deck. The ordnance crews worked with materials that required a specific kind of mental discipline. A single 500-pound general-purpose bomb weighed 512 pounds and contained 262 pounds of tritonal explosive. An Mark 13 aerial torpedo weighed 2,216 pounds and carried a 600-pound Torpex warhead. Aviation and gasoline avgas was stored in the ship's fuel tanks below the hangar deck in quantities that typically exceeded 300,000 gallons. The combination of high explosives, high-energy propellants, and aviation fuel within a steel hull produced a theoretical catastrophe of almost unlimited magnitude. The men who worked the magazines and the bomb hoists and the fueling stations knew this. They followed procedures developed through systematic analysis of every carrier accident and every combat loss to minimize the probability of ignition. And then, the probability found them anyway. This is where the institutional gap between official doctrine and documented reality reveals itself most completely. The Navy's pre-war carrier damage control doctrine was built on a simple assumption that fire aboard a carrier would be localized, containable, and addressable by trained damage control teams using available equipment within the first 30 minutes of ignition. The doctrine specified response times, suppression methods, and acceptable casualty thresholds for each category of shipboard fire. It was a coherent document based on peacetime accident data and engineering projections. It did not account for the conditions actually produced by combat. USS Franklin CV-13 was operating 50 miles off the coast of Japan on March 19, 1945, when a single Japanese aircraft, a D-4Y Judy dive bomber that had penetrated the combat air patrol undetected in low clouds, released 2 550-pound semi-armor-piercing bombs at approximately 700 feet altitude. Both bombs struck the flight deck. The first penetrated to the gallery deck and detonated. The second struck the aft section of the flight deck, where a dozen Corsairs and Avengers had been spotted for a strike launch, their fuel tanks full, their weapons loaded. The bombs that were already armed on those aircraft, Tiny Tim Rocket's 500-pound bombs, aerial torpedoes, began cooking off in the fire within 90 seconds of the initial impact. The Navy's damage control doctrine specified a 30-minute window to contain a shipboard fire. The Franklin's flight deck was not a damage control scenario. It was a continuous detonation sequence that lasted from 07:08 until after 1100. Nearly 4 hours of exploding ordnance and burning aviation fuel aboard a ship that her own crew was simultaneously trying to save and trying to survive. Of the 3,448 men aboard Franklin that morning, 724 were killed. Another 265 were wounded. The ship lost steerage. She lost propulsion for a period and drifted to within 52 miles of the Japanese mainland, closer than any other surviving American carrier came to the Japanese home islands during the war. The crew who stayed aboard, most of whom could have abandoned ship and had the legal authority under naval regulations to do so, chose to fight the fires instead. Chaplain Lieutenant Commander Joseph O'Callahan moved through the burning ship, administering last rites and leading firefighting teams, and directing men away from ammunition that was about to detonate. He was later awarded the Medal of Honor. The ship was saved. she never returned to combat. The Franklin was extreme. What was not extreme was the context that produced her. Between November 1944 and August 1945, Japanese kamikaze attacks struck American carriers with enough frequency and enough consistency that the Navy eventually acknowledged the formal doctrine problem. The Essex-class carriers, designed for conventional bomb and torpedo attacks, were not designed to absorb the kind of damage that results when an aircraft carrying 550 pounds of explosive and 800 gallons of aviation fuel strikes a flight deck full of armed and fueled aircraft while doing 350 miles per hour. The original Essex design had a single layer of armored deck plating at 1.5 inches of special treatment steel over the hangar deck. British fleet carriers of the illustrious class carried 3-inch armored flight decks. The difference in philosophy was this. American naval planners in 1940 had prioritized aircraft capacity over armor protection, calculating that air superiority would prevent enemy aircraft from reaching the carrier in the first place. By 1945, with kamikazes coming through combat air patrols in clouds and at wavetop altitude and from every compass heading simultaneously, that calculation had been overtaken by events. The men below decks during an attack had a specific experience that deserves its own accounting. General quarters sounded at any hour. The alarm was a klaxon that penetrated every space in the ship, including the lowest berthing compartments where men were sleeping after night watches. You had your battle station assigned. You moved to it regardless of where you were in the ship or what you had been doing. All watertight doors and hatches in the affected sections of the ship were secured dogged down, sealed, which meant that the men inside each compartment were locked in. This was doctrine. Compartmentalization was the primary defense against flooding and fire spread. You sealed the compartments to prevent a localized catastrophe from becoming a total loss. The consequence was this. If you were in a compartment that was on the wrong side of a watertight door when a bomb or a kamikaze struck, you were in that compartment. You could hear the guns. Through the steel, you could feel the vibration of the 40mm mounts hammering directly above you. The 5-inch guns in their enclosed turrets produced a concussive shock that traveled through every structural member of the ship. Men below decks described it as being inside a steel drum, while someone beat it from the outside with a sledgehammer. The lights flickered with each firing, loose equipment shifted, the ship heeled through its high-speed turns, and everything not secured moved. Then the impact. If it came as a sound and a physical shock simultaneously. Men who survived multiple hits described a specific phenomenon. The initial explosion was almost not the worst part. It was the secondary detonations, the ammunition cooking off, the aviation fuel igniting, the successive blasts as one fire reached the next, stored quantity of explosives that produced the sustained horror. The lights went out. Emergency lighting came on, dim red. The ventilation stopped. The air in a sealed compartment with 30 men in it began running out of oxygen and accumulating carbon dioxide at a rate that produced headaches within 20 minutes and serious cognitive impairment within 40. Smoke, if fire was in adjacent compartments, seeped through gaskets and cable penetrations, regardless of how carefully the hatches had been secured. The night operations that became standard practice in the latter half of the Pacific War added an entirely separate dimension of danger that the official accounts compress into tactical summaries and operational reports without adequately conveying what they demanded from the men who executed them. Night carrier landings bringing an aircraft onto a moving ship deck in total darkness, using only a thin line of deck edge lighting and the instructions of a landing signal officer working by flashlights were sufficiently hazardous that the Navy established dedicated night carrier air groups, specifically trained for the task, rather than asking standard daytime pilots to simply fly at night. The Night Carrier Air Group, which operated from USS Independence through late 1944 and early 1945, documented its operational loss rate in post-war records. Of 47 aircraft and pilots who flew night combat operations during that deployment, 11 aircraft and their pilots were lost to operational causes, crashes on landing, disorientation, fuel exhaustion, compared to 4 lost to enemy action. The dark killed at nearly 3 times the rate of the Japanese. And yet the night operations were essential because Japanese surface forces moved primarily at night, and the carrier's aircraft were the only weapons capable of stopping them. The landing signal officers, the men who stood at the aft edge of the flight deck with paddles and, later, illuminated wands, bringing pilots aboard in all conditions, held a position of responsibility that the official rating system did not adequately capture. A landing signal officer working a night recovery in a 15-knot crosswind on a pitching deck, talking a pilot who has been airborne for 6 hours and is running low on fuel onto a deck that is rising and falling 8 feet with each swell, is making continuous real-time judgments about aircraft attitude, closure rate, and deck position that, if wrong, kill someone. The LSOs aboard carrier after carrier during Pacific operations reported that the psychological weight of this responsibility accumulated into something that did not release when flight operations secured for the night. The pilots themselves occupied a position aboard the carrier that was structurally separate from the ship's crew and psychologically isolated in ways that were specific to their role. Carrier aviators were the reason the ship existed. Everything else, the 3,400 men, the boilers, the fuel, the food, the guns, existed to put aircraft over targets. The pilots understood this. The ship's crew understood this. The relationship between air group and ship's company was not hostile. Both needed the other absolutely, but it had a quality of mutual incomprehension that both parties acknowledged. Ship's crew rarely knew the pilots by name. Pilots rarely knew much about the men who maintained the ship that launched and recovered them. When a pilot did not return from a strike, the air group processed this in their own way. The berth was emptied. His possessions were inventoried and packaged for return to his family. His wingman, if he survived, wrote a letter. The ship continued flight operations. There was no ceremony during operational tempo. During the strikes on the Philippine Islands in October 1944 and on the Japanese home islands in July 1945, the operational pace allowed for almost no time between loss and continuation. You lost someone. You flew again the next day. The Navy's attrition rate among carrier aviators across the Pacific War deserves specific attention because it is frequently understated in general histories. Of the approximately 14,000 pilots who flew combat operations from fleet carriers between December 1941 and August 1945, roughly 2,900 were killed in combat and approximately 1,700 were lost to operational accidents, crashes, ditching at sea, equipment failures, weather. By mid-1944, most of the pilots flying from fleet carriers were not the men who had been flying from those carriers a year earlier. The average combat experience level of a carrier, air group's pilots measured in hours of operational flying time, actually declined between mid-1943 and mid-1944 as losses were replaced by graduates of the accelerated training programs. Inexperienced pilots flying complex aircraft from moving ships in combat conditions produced predictable results. The accident statistics from 1944 reflect this with a clarity that the official reports do not advertise. The medical facilities aboard a carrier were designed for the ship's peacetime complement and the peacetime casualty assumption. Sick bay aboard an Essex-class carrier was staffed by 2 medical officers, 6 hospital corpsmen, and had 24 treatment bays sufficient for routine injuries and illness among a crew of 2,631. When 393 men were killed or wounded in a single engagement, the sick bay was not a medical facility anymore. It was a triage point. The 2 medical officers made decisions about who received immediate treatment based on survivability, not severity, survivability, and the men who were assessed as unlikely to survive with available resources were set aside and given morphine and whatever comfort was possible. This happened. It is documented in multiple action reports. The Navy's official casualty statistics for carrier operations from 1942 through 1945 record 5,087 officers and enlisted men killed in action aboard fleet and light carriers. The operational accident deaths are recorded separately, and add another 2,341. The wounded total across all carriers exceeded 14,000. There was no rotation off the ship during a deployment. You were aboard until the ship returned to port. A typical Western Pacific deployment in 1944 and 1945 ran between 90 and 120 days at sea. The carrier's replenishment at sea capability meant the ship did not need to return to port for logistical reasons. You stayed out. The crew of USS Essex during the strikes on the Japanese home islands in July and August of 1945 had been at sea for 92 continuous days when the war ended. The psychological effects of this sustained operation were documented and largely ignored. The Navy's Bureau of Medicine and Surgery began studying what it called operational fatigue in carrier crews in 1944, prompted by an increase in reported accidents and errors that could not be explained by equipment failures or inadequate training. Sleep deprivation at this level produces specific documented effects that the Navy's own medical studies from 1944 and 1945 identified in carrier crews. Reaction time degraded measurably after 72 hours of restricted sleep. Error rates in mechanical procedures increased by factors that the studies quantified, but that command leadership was reluctant to act on because there was no operational alternative. The aircraft needed to fly, the deck needed to be manned, the boilers needed to run. Men worked past the point where the medical studies said they were operating at any reasonable fraction of their trained capacity. And they did this not for a day or a week, but for months at a time during extended Pacific operations. Fatigue operated as its own force aboard these ships, separate from danger and separate from discomfort, with its own timeline and its own effects. Flight operations during major strikes began at 0430 and ran, with the deck respotted and reloaded between cycles, until late afternoon. The launch cycle for a major strike involved the entire Air Department spotted aircraft, running engines, launched at 30-second intervals, and the recovery cycle that followed required equally intense coordination. A pilot who flew a strike to truck and back was in his aircraft for 5 to 6 hours. The plane captain who maintained that aircraft had been on deck since 0300. The ordnance crew who loaded the bombs had worked through the previous night. A full operational day during a major strike series ran 18 to 20 hours for the most critical deck personnel. They then slept for 4 hours and returned. The study examined crews aboard 4 Essex-class carriers following extended deployments and found that 34% of enlisted men and 28% of officers reported symptoms consistent with what would now be recognized as combat stress reactions, hypervigilance, sleep disruption, even when sleep was available, inability to concentrate, and a specific phenomenon the study described as detachment from personal survival concern, meaning men who had stopped caring whether they lived or died in any practical decision-making sense. The Navy classified the study and continued operations at the same pace. The study's recommendations regarding mandatory rest rotations and crew relief schedules were acknowledged and not implemented. The men adapted in ways that adaptation does not quite cover. They developed a specific fatalism that was different from despair. Men who had been through multiple kamikaze attacks described a restructuring of their internal experience of danger. The first attack produced terror. The second produced something closer to controlled fear. By the third and fourth, many men described a state of almost clinical detachment during the engagement itself, a narrowing of attention to the immediate task. Man the gun, pass the ammunition, fight the fire, stay at your station with an absence of the anticipated emotional response. They were not unaffected. In the aftermath, when the dead were counted and the burned sections of the ship were being cleaned, the emotion came. Men who had functioned perfectly during the attack found themselves unable to stop shaking an hour afterward. Some could not eat for days. Some could not sleep. None of them were offered anything resembling psychological support in any formal sense. You reported to your division officer if you felt you could not perform your duties. Otherwise, you reported to your station. The survivors went home. They went back to farms in Iowa and factories in Ohio and offices in New York and hardware stores in Georgia. They did not talk about it in most cases because there was nothing in civilian life that provided a useful context for what they were trying to describe, and because the culture of the time did not provide permission for men to describe it. Some drank. Some developed what their families described as a remoteness that never fully went away. A few wrote about it decades later, when they were old enough that the events felt sufficiently historical to be discussable. The institutional changes that followed the war's end tell their own story about what those 4 years had actually revealed. The Navy's post-war carrier design program incorporated the 3.5-inch armored flight deck that the wartime Essex class had lacked. The hangar deck fire suppression systems were redesigned entirely, moving away from the carbon dioxide smothering systems that had proven inadequate in combat to high-velocity fog systems that could saturate a burning hangar space with fine water droplets within seconds of ignition. The aviation fuel system was redesigned to use fuel less volatile than the avgas that had made every carrier in the Pacific a potential catastrophe. These changes were enacted because the existing designs had failed under conditions the pre-war planners had not adequately anticipated, and the price of that failure had been measured in the 5,087 officers and men recorded killed in action aboard carriers, plus the 2,341 operational dead, plus the 14,000 wounded, plus the 3 carriers that went to the bottom, and the dozens more that required months in shipyards to rebuild. The Navy revised its doctrine. It did not revise the official characterization of what carrier service had been. The queens of the fleet remained the queens of the fleet in the post-war histories. The steel decks, and the 142-degree boiler rooms, and the weevils in the flour, and the 40 minutes in the dark with 11 other men listening to ammunition cook off through the bulkhead. Those details went into the personal memories of the men who had been there and largely stayed there. The men who crewed carriers during the decisive campaigns of 1944 and 1945 understood themselves to be part of something historically significant. The significance was not abstract. You launched aircraft that sank ships. You maintained engines that kept the flight deck operational. You handled ordnance that destroyed targets. The relationship between individual labor and strategic outcome was shorter and more visible aboard a carrier than in almost any other form of military service. A boilerman in Boiler Room 4 knew that the steam he was tending was turning the propellers that were moving the ship into the wind that was launching the aircraft that were attacking Japan. The chain was unbroken and you were in it. This did not make the 142-degree air more breathable. It did not cool the berthing compartments. It did not replace the men who died in the fires. One of them was aviation machinist's mate second class Elmer Dunn of Wooster, Ohio. Dunn was 20 years old when he reported aboard USS Bunker Hill in January 1945. He was assigned to the Air Department, specifically to the maintenance of the TBF Avenger torpedo bombers in VT-84. He was aboard on May 11, 1945. He was in the hangar deck when the first kamikaze struck the flight deck above him. The fireball that came through the forward elevator opening drove him and 11 other men into a maintenance bay on the port side of the hangar. The hatch to the maintenance bay could be dogged from the inside. Dunn dogged it. He and the 11 men in that space waited in the dark. The lights had failed immediately while the fire burned outside. They could hear the ammunition cooking off. They could feel the heat through the steel bulkhead. They were in there for 40 minutes before the hatch was opened from the outside by a damage control team that had found them by tracing the dogged hatches systematically through the smoke. Of the 12 men in that maintenance bay, 11 survived. 1 died of smoke inhalation during the 40 minutes. His name was Aviation Ordnance Man, 3rd Class Donald Pfeiffer of Cleveland, Ohio. He was 19 years old. Dunn carried Pfeiffer's name with him for the rest of his life in a way that he described in a letter to Pfeiffer's family in 1987, 42 years after the fact, as something he never put down. Dunn returned to Worcester after the war and worked for 31 years as a mechanic at a Chevrolet dealership on East Liberty Street. He attended the Bunker Hill Survivors Association reunions every year from 1955 until 2003, when his health prevented further travel. He died in 2009 at the age of 84. The last entry in his personal log from the war, written on August 15, 1945, the day Japan surrendered, was a list of names. 41 names. The men from his division who did not come home. No other words, just the names.